Colleagues, we're going to bring in Dr. Anna Carlisle now, who will speak to us on the issue of LGBTQ inclusive educational leadership. Anna is the incoming head of the Department of Educational Studies at Goldsmiths, University of London. She's a former youth worker and teacher and is now senior lecturer in inclusive education. Her approach to research and teaching is collaborative, intersectional, and participant-led, and includes projects on decolonizing the university, valuing the expertise of people of color in HE, Black girls' survival, agency, and resilience, transgender children experiences in healthcare, and LGBTQ inclusive education in primary schools and serving faith communities. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues all, Dr. Anna Carlisle.
Hello, thanks for having me on today. I'm just going to start my slideshow. There we go. So I just wanted to say that what I'm going to talk about today has been framed up by this research, which has led to this article on teacher experiences of LGBTQ inclusive education in primary schools serving faith communities in England, UK. And I became interested in this because following the Trojan horse set of incidents in the exact same area of Birmingham a few months later, there were a set of protests around LGBT inclusive education, which were really accompanied by a very Islamophobic media response. It was the same schools and the same communities that were involved in that protest. And that's why I wanted to do this piece of research I'm going to talk about. So, LGBT inclusive education and inclusion more broadly is a real challenge for our sector. Inclusion is really everybody's business. And what I found in my research was that teachers were very anxious about talking about, particularly about LGBT inclusive education, and particularly in schools serving faith communities. So I don't just mean faith schools or church schools, I mean any school that serves a community of faith or mixed communities of faith. So one of the things that I found was really, really important was to do this work in an intersectional way that practices and models solidarity. So a focus on just one area of equalities lends itself actually to the kind of homonormativity and nationalist response that we saw in the media around those protests in Birmingham. So what was happening was the media was kind of setting up a false binary, a false dichotomy between religious people on the one hand and LGBT people on the other. And that just simply isn't the case. There's a vast overlap. There are gay religious people, there are religious transgender people, and people who fight for LGBT rights will fight against racism, and people who fight against racism will fight for LGBT rights. So it's about really kind of reframing the story in a much more nuanced way. So I find that it's very useful when talking with teachers who are anxious about saying the wrong thing and upsetting their families. We should use the Equality Act 2010 set of protected characteristics and reassure them that there is no hierarchy of equality. What I found in training and in watching schools do their training and delivering training myself is that everybody is behind inclusion when it comes to SEND. So start with that. And then, of course, everybody is behind inclusion, well, they say they are when it comes to addressing racism. It's very hard to disagree with that in a room full of people. You can then move on to the LGBT inclusion. Often something that comes up is this idea of whether teachers should come out as LGBT themselves. And what the research shows is that it's much more about focusing on committed relationships. So what I found was when I talk to schools and senior managers was that often there's a sort of conflation between same-sex relationships and the idea of promiscuity. This is a very old stereotype. And what I found was that when you reframe things around committed relationships, people were much more comfortable about it. So a focus on the same-sex marriage amendment, for example. In terms of teachers coming out, the other important thing is to create a space for teachers to feel able to be themselves. And what that does is it shows the whole school community that just being yourself, whatever that self is not just acceptable, but very important. In terms of LGBT inclusive leadership in schools, it's important to think about the idea that LGBT inclusion is safeguarding. So I'm thinking about my 5-year-old son now, and I'm thinking about how open he is to talking about his two mums at school, because his teachers worked really hard to make sure that he feels included. He is more able to share his experiences. There are no secrets, there are no taboo topics, because he feels he belongs, he feels safe. Anything around bullying has got to be a safeguarding issue, and inclusive work will help to prevent this. And any good safeguarding policy will include emotional well-being. You know, when children feel included, they feel happy. Often when you talk to schools about LGBT inclusive education, they immediately think about the children. What they don't think about is the children's parents, their siblings, their aunties and uncles who might be members of the LGBT community. LGBT inclusion is good for learning. When I teach this stuff to PGCE students, I've got a room full of 200 students, and it's always a physics teacher who puts his hand up and says, but I'm here to teach physics, or I'm here to teach maths, what's this got to do with that? Well, the fact is, if children feel safe from bullying, they'll have space in their brains to learn the maths or the physics. If they feel included, then they can get involved in that collaborative classroom learning. And if they learn about difference and inclusion, they're actually learning critical thinking skills, which are very transferable. I often get asked about working with parents and carers on LGBT inclusion, particularly in schools serving faith communities. One interesting thing that a teacher said was, why would I write home to parents to ask if I can celebrate Lesbian and Gay History Month? I wouldn't write home to ask if I was allowed to celebrate Black History Month. And the point that she was making was that in the Equality Act there is no hierarchy of equality. It's important to be available at the school gate where parents can ask questions, and to explain how LGBT inclusive work is part of a wider piece of work on all the protected characteristics. You can also work with parents on how faith-based moral frameworks all talk about being kind to your neighbour, even if people aren't like you, and about how, only God can judge us, but God requires us to be nice to each other. It's about the work being an anti-bullying context. It's not about trying to make children gay, which is often something that comes up. And it's also about being empathic about people's real, genuine fears. Be there and listen to parents. And don't forget that some of the parents that you're listening to might be of faith and LGBT. I'm just going to look at my other screen because the writing's a bit small on this one to read it to you. But basically, supporting a learning community in your school or college will require you to be congruent, and that means be real. It's about decolonising the curriculum, not just of institutional racism, but of heteronormativity and classism as well. It's about usualising diversity, representing all different kinds of people right across the curriculum. It means curriculum, and it means what you put on the wall in your classroom, but it also means foregrounding expertise by experience in your classrooms. You've got a class of kids who speak 24 different languages. What an amazing resource. Instead of seeing that as a problem to solve, see it as a huge, rich vein of information. The children can learn from each other about each other's contexts. It's also about not just about being in the classroom, but it's about informing and educating everybody in your school community, parents, lunchroom supervisors, the caretaker. It's about making sure that everybody's on board with inclusion. And it's about making sure that things like forms are inclusive. If a form asks for mum's name and dad's name, not only is it not including children who have two mums, but it's not including children who are in foster care or living with their grandparents. And it's also about making sure that all of your policies are up to date with the Equality Act. We have lots of success stories of primary schools which serve faith communities, doing LGBT inclusive education, even schools for children with severe and complex disabilities. And I just wanted to show you this book here, which is called How to Transform Your School into an LGBT Friendly Place, which I wrote with one of my MA students. Each chapter is about a different way that you can make your school inclusive, and you can use any of the principles to help you include other characteristics out of the Equality Act. It's got sample policies in it, lesson plans, and links to support as well. So I think I'll end it there. Just going to end the show, and thank you so much for having me talk today.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Hannah. Really good stuff. Really, really good stuff. Can you pull out for us a couple of the principles out of that book, for, just for the audience listening across the globe? You know, what kind of things should school leaders or educational leaders be doing to create those safe spaces for all?
Thank you. I mean, one thing is that often the LGBT stuff falls on the known gay teacher in the school, but it's kind of like safeguarding. You know, inclusion is everybody's business. And what's really important to make these things sustainable is to do a good review of policies and a good review of curriculum. On the curriculum point, it's important to steer away from a kind of special day thing, a bit like we don't just want to look at Black History and Black History Month, we need to weave it through everything. So it's the same with any of the protected characteristics. It's about weaving it through, you know, even on your maths worksheets, you can represent different kinds of people, weaving it through the curriculum all year long so that if that one gay teacher leaves who maybe started the work, the whole project doesn't leave with them, it becomes sustainable. The other thing is, if anyone's going to do this work in a school, everybody in school has to feel safe. So it's like a jigsaw, everything has to fit together. You have to review your inclusion and your behaviour policy if you're going to start these conversations. Because too often a teacher will very excitedly start a conversation about LGBT inclusion, but then the kids will go out in the playground and there's no framework to address bullying. So it's important to do it as a whole school project.
And thank you very much for that. One question from Serena Alexis has come in for you. So if you can give a quick response, what about the difficulties of creating these safe places in single-sex schools, in particular boys' schools?
That is a great question. And what's really interesting is that I've got a PhD student who's just finished her first year looking at exactly this question. What we found really interestingly is that single-sex schools can actually be more inclusive than mixed-sex schools. And one of the reasons for that is that children whose gender or sexual orientation kind of falls outside the norm, in a single-sex school, there's no ambiguity about who's in that school. So I recently interviewed 13 families, including their transgender children. What was really interesting is that a lot of trans boys like being in a girls' school because they will say, at least I know what I'm not. And the school doesn't chuck them out, they keep them included and they allow them to use a different toilet. One of the things that my PhD student, her name is Alison Zions, look out for her, she'll be great, has found is she runs a rainbow club in her school. So this is for a kind of LGBT inclusion. And 7 of her students were trans boys. This is in a girls' school. And they asked her to run a lads' club in their school. So she's now running a rainbow club and a lads' club. So I think it's worth thinking outside the box a little bit about single-sex schools. It's quite interesting what's happening. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Anna.
Thanks, Paul.
Colleagues, we will bring in Dr. Denise Miller to the conversation. Dr. Denise Miller is senior lecturer in education at the University of Greenwich, and she's going to talk to us about Black British women in children and young people's services. Denise had her BA from the University of Greenwich and has taught in primary schools for 8 years before returning to Greenwich um, to study and before doing her educational psychology doctorate. As an educational psychologist, Denise has worked mainly with supporting parents and teachers to meet the needs of marginalized children and young people and those with special educational needs and disability. Denise is also program leader at the University of Greenwich School of Education and also an educational psychologist in private practice. Dr. Denise Miller.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that really nice introduction. I'm just going to share my screen with you. Let's see if this works. Okay, I'm hoping you can see that. Okay, so I'm going to present to you the findings for my research study that I undertook for my doctoral thesis called Black British Managers of Children and Young People Services. I'm going to start with a quote from two of the participants. Deflated, depleted, downtrodden. I've come this far, and at my age, and all that I have done, I didn't do it 100%, I gave 200%. And someone else who did half of that can be above me? Yes, I'm disillusioned. So there were lots and lots of barriers, so much so that in the end I left. I stepped down. After 36 years of teaching, the pressure became too much. In thinking about intersectionality in terms of race and gender, let's start with some cold, hard facts. It's a fact. BAME women can struggle in the same way as white women. However, unlike white women, we invariably encounter incidents of racism. Did you know we're more likely to be unemployed than any other group in the labour market? Did you know that even when we are in employment, we're disproportionately more likely to be in temporary jobs? Did you know that we suffer from cultural stereotyping? And believe me, I know all about the stereotype threat of the angry Black woman. Did you know that we remain heavily underrepresented in the higher echelons of organisations, including academia, where I work at the moment? Did you know that BAME women are more likely to be in jobs at lower skill levels, even though we're more highly qualified? And we are less likely to be earning salaries associated with more highly remunerated posts. Sadly, and despite being highly qualified and hardworking in many ways, my working life history is represented in those facts. Not only do they resonate with me, but they also illustrate the experiences of Black British women. Now, throughout my life, I've encountered many jarring, microaggressive insults on a daily basis, and many of them have to do with my Black Britishness. From being told to go back to my own country, from asking when am I going home. Now, I was born in South East London. The development of my national identity arguably has been seriously compromised. And as a psychologist, I find this really, really interesting. I'm well versed in attachment theories, and I know that if you develop an insecure attachment from a very young age, it's likely to lead to really serious adverse consequences throughout your life. Now, Michelle Obama, in an interview in 2018, said, "We often don't get to see ourselves. We don't hear ourselves because we don't control the narrative." She goes on to say, "How rare is it that a Black woman, a modern day woman, gets an opportunity to tell her story?" Now, I believe and I agree with Michelle Obama that our stories do and our words have power. And my study was born of this premise. The research question was, how do Black British women become and experience being managers in children and young people services? Now, these organisations, they work with children and young people, and if you look through their policy documents, they will espouse to be egalitarian workplaces. Now, I recruited 10 Black British women, and they all work for various sectors within the CYPS. It's a convenient sample. The participants were between the age of 40 and 60, and each of them had at least 5 years working experience as a manager. I transcribed the interviews and I used grounded theory approaches to analyse them. I'm going to share with you some of the themes very, very briefly. The first theme relates to the early and formative years. Now, like my parents, my participants' parents came from Jamaica or the Caribbean in the 1950s and 60s, and their sole purpose really was to better themselves and their families' lives. And as noted by the women, their parents told them, "There's no glass ceiling on you." They did not put a glass ceiling on their ambitions. They envisaged that a good education would provide their children with the key to unlocking a ladder where they could climb in order to achieve their full potential. They told them, however, you must work twice as hard. In fact, my parents probably told me 3 or 4 times harder. Not all the women had the same experience. One woman said to me that she was told that she should go out to work and start earning money. But nevertheless, she said, her sister served as a really positive role model. So essentially, what this theme highlighted was that the participants' parents and family members, and particularly their mothers, served as important role models in their lives. And they taught them all about determination, decision making, and work ethics. Unfortunately, when the women got to the school gates, things changed. Unlike what they reported in their home lives, they found that teachers' expectations were really low. Some of them had condescending marks when they told them what they wanted to be in their future lives. They soon realised that being part of a Black and minority ethnic group was not necessarily a positive thing. It's striking, however, when I spoke to the women, that they still remained resolute and determined, and they showed great resilience. The next theme highlights how they continue to experience racism within their workplaces. Invariably, the women talked about organisational cultures as obstacles to their career progression. It said it's who you know and who gets protected. They said they had limited access to highly important social networks. And according to the participants, these cliquey networks served to bring together a select group of people who behaved in institutionally racist ways. They told me that had they been included in those groups, they might have been privy to life-changing, important information. And so they continued to work harder. They found racism much more implicit, much more subtle, and harder to prove. They also said that they felt that because of their skin colour, more highly qualified white people were getting jobs that they were entitled to. And rather than work twice as hard as their parents advised, they were now working 20 times harder. Notably, however, lots of the participants said that they felt that the colour of their skin meant that they were being discriminated against over and above their gender. They felt that both white women and white men encountered benefits that they did not get. Now, the final theme relates to the silent catastrophe. And I borrowed this term from Diane Abbott. She used the term, I think, in the 1990s to describe the way in which Black children and young people were being failed by the education system. And likewise, in my study, what I found was that Black British female managers, workforces, their employers were failing them. The women's comments said that the combined effects of race and culture, and possibly gender, rendered that the glass ceiling that people talk about was insufficient. The glass ceiling imagery signifies that all women have an inability to get to the top. However, the barriers that they encountered were much more significant. It was a concrete ceiling, which was much more persistent and pernicious. So the women started to lose confidence and they questioned their abilities. And as you can see, the consequences are that many of the women thought about leaving. So one of the women, after 36 years of teaching, she left the CYPS workforce. So I'm just going to go briefly and speak to you about some of my ideas for future research. I wasn't able really to look at the idea of defining Black Britishness, which really is intriguing to me. And I think that if I go back, I might ask some really pertinent questions to elicit some really good data. Also, the women talked about how disappointed they were that many of their Black colleagues were not supportive of them, and they didn't form a cohesive group, and there seemed to be fighting within that group. In terms of multi-sectoral research, it would be good really to see if the same sorts of findings can be, or the same sorts of results can be said for other organisations. In terms of policy and practice, obviously there's lots to be done. Anti-racist training, it needs to be that policies and procedures need to be looked at and making sure they're not just collecting dust on a shelf, and that people understand what their responsibilities are and that they're held accountable. So targets are looked at, and people are held accountable to find out whether they've achieved the targets and why they haven't. Okay, I shall end my presentation now on that note.
Thank you, Diane. This is really, really interesting, especially for those of us who work in education and sometimes don't get to see what is happening in another sector. And I know there are some other persons on the call as well from industry as well who are also getting an insight into the work of the children, youth sector and also of the education sector, as was described earlier by Asima and Anna. So that is, what do you think in your mind? You talk about this concrete ceiling. What can institutions do then to support these women?
Thank you, Paul, for the question. I mean, it's a huge question, and there's so many different areas that need to be addressed. I think first and foremost, maybe on the outset, at the interview panels, maybe to make sure that it's clearly represented. It's not just a white panel interviewing. It needs to be that the workforce data needs to be looked at to see where there are gaps in the remuneration of staff and why that might be. It needs to be that somebody's in a post that's passionate about following through on these ideas, and it's not just a tick box exercise. That's what I can think of at the moment.
No, that's interesting. And I'm going to bring in Pansu here, but I know that just this week there was some research published. I saw it in the BBC that said one council, I don't remember where the council is located, is moving to look at different types of positive actions because they felt that blind shortlisting wasn't working, because according to them, they had listed out a whole range of methods, that interventions which they had used, and for some reason everything seemed to have failed. So in my view, it almost sounded like a system failure, so that was really interesting. But I think the struggle continues. Colleagues, I'm pleased to bring in Dr. Ponsu Marusi, to talk about gender and leadership. Ponsu is Associate Professor of Educational Leadership and Management at the Center for Education Studies, University of Warwick. She's also a Research Associate at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa, and a rated researcher by the National Research Foundation of South Africa. Her research interests include gender and educational leadership, with a specific use of feminist and intersectional epistemologies. Ponsu is a member of Belmas Council, Belmas being the British Educational Leadership Management Administration Society, and she co-convenes the Gender and Educational Leadership Research Interest Group. She's also interested in issues concerning educational leadership preparation and development, and identity development, and she researches leadership in South Africa and in the UK context. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues all, Dr. Ponsu Marusi.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul, for the introduction. And thank you again for creating this space, giving us another platform where we can have conversations about our field. And I imagine that these are not always going to be comfortable conversations, but that nonetheless there will be conversations that are constructive and conversations that we need to get going. So in thinking about this talk today, I'm actually grateful that I was quite at the end, and I think this has worked out exactly as I had anticipated. That the groundwork has already been done for me, in that people already understand what the nature of inequities are, and so I really don't need to go over any of those. And my presentation is a little bit different from the others in the sense that, one, I don't have slides, so I hope that you are looking at something presentable, whatever it is that you are seeing. I don't know. So I thought that I would think in much more general terms about issues of gender and gender equity, specifically in educational leadership. So in putting this conversation together, I thought I would raise just a couple of issues. There are many issues. And I think my colleagues have already raised a whole range of issues that affect women, or issues that affect everybody that works in institutions of education, whether it's early years, or whether it's schools, or whether it's higher education, or even organizations that are private but that have a band or a banner of education attached to them. So as someone who has been engaged and someone who has researched the field for quite some time now, I thought I would raise just two but very related points in trying to generate some discussion. And hopefully these are not going to be discussions that end here, because as it is, we don't even have enough time, but that these are discussions and questions that I know that some of my colleagues are already engaged in them in their own different work, but I'm hoping that there will be some other new people who have never thought of researching or looking into issues of gender and gender equity in educational organizations, and that hopefully this will spark their interest even more, and that people will begin to have an idea of what it is that we go on about. So the 2 points that I'm going to base this talk on, one is how we have been defining gender and therefore gender equity in the past 4 or 5 decades since the beginning of the field. And how, therefore, as a result of the way we have been defining gender, we have done research and what that research has led to or has not led to. And then hopefully I will end with what I suggest, which is certainly not the way, but just one of the ways in which things could be done differently in a way that could begin to have some difference, I think. So firstly, with regard to how we have been defining gender, and this is not about each definition of gender that everybody puts in their paper or in their research. People don't usually even do that. But the definition that I'm talking about is the definition that has been informing all the work that we've been doing in gender. And that the way we have understood and conceptualized gender has been binary, has been heteronormative, and has been very exclusive. And so we tend to look into gender as categorization of people, and therefore we look at the differences between these categories of people. And these categories of people tend to be men and women, excluding a range of other people, of course, who may not even identify with either of those categorizations, or who do not subscribe to any of those broad definitions. So what work addressing gender equity has then attended to do is to highlight the differences between these different categories of people, mainly between the differences between men and women. And so strategies of gender equity would be based on the assumption that what women lack in order for them to perhaps be equally represented or compete with men at the same level with men would just be for them to get the right level of skills and build enough confidence and a whole range of things that I hope that many of the people who are listening may already have an inkling into. And what that then does is to ignore a whole range of power systems that affect the lives and the work of these women. And these are systems of patriarchy, systems of colonialism, systems of apartheid, and how the intricate nature of these systems continuously affect or inform the way organizations work, the way organizations are arranged, and the way cultures of organizations develop. And it is those structures within organizations and those cultures within organizations that I argue continue affecting women more than the fact that women would be regarded as not having confidence or not having the necessary training. So what these a narrow definition again tend to do is to homogenize these women, and by so doing they fail to see and acknowledge the differences between the women themselves. And so strategies of gender equity in this sense again would not only exclude men, which is ironic, and given the fact that it is men and women, whichever way you look at it, it's people of different orientations, different genders, different backgrounds who work within educational institutions and educational organizations. But what strategies that address gender equity that are informed by these binary and these heteronormative and these exclusive definitions of gender tend to do is that they would not only exclude men, but they would also lump all these women together. And this would be women of different races. And a lot of experiences about Black women has already been alluded by the work of Denise and others. And women of different sexualities, women of different abilities and disabilities. And what then happens is that focusing more on these individuals who are different, but addressing them through a lot of the time with a blanket approach that just looks at them because they happen to be falling under the category of women, and therefore ignoring the differences between this or among these women themselves. And obviously, people who are gender non-conformist, who are not identifying with either of those groups, also tend to be excluded. So, and I don't want to sound all doom and gloom, that those strategies or interventions of gender equity that are informed by those kinds of definitions have not worked. There has been some progress and there has been some differences. And these has been differences that focusing more on the number of women who get into leadership positions. And but what has happened is that these have tended to ignore the systems in place that are meant to and supposed to support these women as they work. So what has tended to happen is that for some of them, no sooner had they qualified, no sooner had they proved themselves that they are aggressive and are confident enough that because the systems have been left intact and they are not supportive of the women in the way in which they are arranged, in the way in which they work, and that women cannot stay in these positions. And that does not only sabotage those women who are in those positions, it sabotages women who are aspiring to get into those positions, but also the young people that all of us are aiming to inspire and serve as role models for, which is learners in schools and even young women and men and students in higher education institutions. And that very much links to the next point, which is what my colleagues have already spoken to, which is the underrepresentation of women. And this is my second point. Research has then tended to look at the underrepresentation of women. So if you were to look at as far back as the late 1970s and early 80s, when the fields of gender in educational leadership started, and that the key question, I'm not saying that colleagues have not been asking different questions, but the main question that has been driving a lot of the research is about the underrepresentation of women. And then again, that is one question that has made all of us, or the majority of us, focus on getting the women into occupying these positions of leadership and ignoring the rest of everything else that make that work. And so what has happened is that the progress that we make, sometimes we regress on it because no sooner had appointments been made, some gaps are created because as women just find it difficult to stay, as I've already said. And I came across what I thought was an interesting BBC story of Yvonne Connolly, a Jamaican woman who came from Jamaica to England in 1963 as a supply teacher. And she then went on to become the first Black female head teacher in England in 1969. And I thought it was interesting that some of the reactions that Mrs. Connolly received in her first one of her first experiences were when she was telling people that at the education office, telling people that she's here because she's looking for opportunities to work as a supply teacher, and people would look at her and comment, "But oh, you are Black," as if she didn't know. But what struck me was that what she experienced 50 years ago, it is still what many of the people are still experiencing. Many of the Black women and even sometimes the Black men are still experiencing now. And that goes to show that the point that I made about clumping people together and interventions that are not looking specifically at who the people are who work within which organizations. And so I thought that one of the things that have been positive raised by the sad and unfortunate killing of George Floyd, and therefore the activities of the Black Lives Matter movement, is that people have shared so many of their individual anecdotes, stories about racism, and how that racism perhaps interacts with sexism and a whole range of other things. And it is those individual stories and anecdotes that we really look to share in the work that we do. But perhaps the mode of sharing them doesn't get us far, because I can publish an article on interviewing 3 or 5 women head teachers, but where is that going to go? And what policy is that going to influence? And what institutional practice is that going to change? But the point I wanted to make about Mrs. Connolly's story was that she became the first Black female head teacher in London in 1969. And I was just amazed at how 50 years down the line, very little has changed. Little has changed in terms of the very representation that has been spoken about, but also in terms of the experiences that some of the Black women are being subjected to in their attempt to look for these kinds of employment. And so the fact that women are still underrepresented, I mean, that head teachers, Black female head teachers account for less than 1%, 0.3%, I think that was the last I checked. And that when it comes to universities, Black female leaders are almost non-existent. That's how small the numbers are. So I thought that I would summarize, I would end by suggesting that perhaps we need to look into this whole question of gender inequity in a different way. And my input is that because we've been asking so much about underrepresentation of women, perhaps we need to move away from that. And because that has tended to address more the equality question rather than the very crucial equity question that this forum is hoping to address. So, and I observed that in colleagues of mine have also observed that in all these years, some of the interventions and some of the strategies will include programs that tend to develop women. There will be programs like Athena Swan, there would be the Aurora, there would be the Women Ed, different kinds of initiatives that attempt to get women ready and prepare women and get them ready for occupying these positions. But as I've already alluded, what that tends to do is that it focuses more on the women and completely ignores the systems within which these women work. So when they go into these organizations, people's mindsets have not changed. People's attitudes have not changed. The cultures of work have not changed. And so no sooner had they been appointed, they're battling with the very same things that make it even more unpalatable and unattractive for other younger women to get into those positions. And that is why the whole representation just keeps on going on and on and on, and it feels like we are not making any progress at all as far as addressing gender equity or equality is concerned. So I really thought I would end it there with a suggestion that perhaps we need to look into organizations. Perhaps we need to be researching organizations and looking at where are these schools located? Where are these universities located? Who are the people, who are the stakeholders, who are the people who work in these organizations? What are the cultures of work? What are the work arrangements? What are the policies? What are the other social practices within these organizations? And I know that what I'm suggesting is not something that can be achieved overnight. It's a lot of work. And I mean, if I can do a study interviewing 89 women school principals and not be able to go anywhere with regard to changing or contributing towards the change of policy with regard to that, how much more can I get with regard to researching one school? But what I'm suggesting is not a big policy moves, because I think there's another conversation that I think needs to be had, and that one is about the gap between what we do as researchers and academics and what policymakers do, and how that gap can be narrowed so that what we do seems to be feeding into policy and changing and influencing practice in some ways. So what I'm suggesting is that if we change the focus slightly, not stop completely, but if we focus our efforts into looking more into these organizations, that perhaps that the small changes, what some of my colleagues have referred to as small wins, some of the small changes that can happen within any one individual organization could be a step in the right direction. So if a change is made within a school, because the school has worked together with the practitioners and the academics and everyone involved to try and understand what are we about as a school, what are we about as a department, what are we about as an organization, and try and look into where would we like to go in terms of being more inclusive and in terms of being more accommodating to everyone that we think we represent. I'm going to end there.
Thank you very much, Ponsu. This is inspiring, as you see in the chat, people giving you lots of plaudits and so on. Because we're so pressed for time, I'm just going to ask you one quick question. And somebody here, Charmaine Roach, has asked, how do we work on system level change?
I think that's a very difficult question, and that's why I'm hoping that if we can start on the ground on making small changes within the organizations within which we work, then we can inform our systems working up from bottom up, because that is really difficult. Because what makes that even more difficult is that the mindset, it's very difficult to change people's mindsets. It's very difficult to change people's attitudes. And it's very difficult to do work that influence policy. And because systems have been there for a long time, and are so embedded in how organizations operate and how people think and how timetables in schools are designed. Nobody even questions that. How meetings are arranged within schools. And I think with the work in intersectionality, there's beginning to be different ways of looking at things and how the work affects different people who work within institutions. But I'm suggesting a kind of a bottom-up approach that would hopefully affect and address or influence systems.
Thank you. What I'm hearing from all four presentations is that institutions reinforces inequity, and it is the policies and the practices and the behaviors of those institutions. And I think I'm just going to invite each of the presenters to respond. If you had something to say to an educational leader from nursery to university listening in, who is saying, you know, I want to change something in respect of, you know, the matters that you described in your presentation, or in the case of Denise in the Children and Young People Services, what would be that one thing? This is almost like your 1 minute opportunity to contribute to solution. Let us assume that we have all of these, you know, leaders listening, and they are coming to you. What would be that one thing that you could tell them? Asima.
I would say persevere, because that's one word I would just tell them. You have to keep doing it. If you shy away from getting into an educational leadership role, you will never get the opportunity. You have to try.
Thank you. Denise.
Yeah, I agree with Azima, and also try and focus on BAME representation within the workforce at all levels, I think. Because otherwise you're fighting against the systems that are trying to maintain the status quo. And that's a really tricky thing to do.
Thank you. Thank you. Anna.
Well, as a new head of department, you know, there's a huge amount of things to deal with. And so I've decided to really focus on one thing, which I think will carry everything else through: recovery from COVID, recruiting our students, making people feel safe, inclusion. And that is to frame everything I do around inclusion and social justice. It's not a bolt-on, it's a driver for change.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you very much. Ponsu, back to you.
Training and developing and training more women clean your house, because it is only until we've looked into the way organizations work that we will be able to, I thought I was on mute, sorry, that we will be able to, I think, get some way into getting everybody to see, because at the end of the day, this ends up being certain people's responsibility. It's women who research gender issues, because the understanding has been women is gender, when it shouldn't be like that. So clean your house would be my message.
Absolutely, absolutely, and thank you very much. Excellent food for thought, and some really useful suggestions there coming through. My takeaway, and certainly what I hope will be the takeaway for everybody on this call as we edge closer towards 5 o'clock, would be these three things. One, there is no hierarchy of equality or equity, and it's really, really ever so important for us to think, that we have to work towards collective equity in our education systems and in our policies and in our practices and in our curricula and in our behaviors and attitudes and so on. And the second point, which also came out of Anna's presentation, is that about usualizing diversity or normalizing certain difficult conversations around diversity and inclusion. Those conversations can be very difficult sometimes, but very, very important so that everybody can become comfortable over time. But for now, we should become uncomfortable, for now, we should become comfortable in being uncomfortable. But these are conversations that we need to have until we get to the space where we can usualize or normalize diversity. And I think that is absolutely important. And the third thing I would like to say, as part of the cleaning the house narrative, is that equity is now. We have endured, and I use the collective we, all marginalized peoples, generations of inequity, generations of abuse. And I think we are at this stage in our own development as a people, as societies, that we need to keep pressing for this, because equity cannot wait. Equity is now. So we do hope, colleagues, that this has been a useful conversation. We hope to have these free online broadcasts at least once a month as part of our civic duty for educational equity services. And we will begin to problematize these issues right across the year. And we hope that next month you will be able to join us. For now, enjoy your Friday afternoon and good evening.
Thank you.